The Peterson casket should have weighed exactly 237 pounds when we sealed it. I'm Devon, and I've been running the crematory at Restview Memorial for 11 years. In this business, precision matters. Weight, temperature, timing, everything has to be exact. That's why I always document the casket weight before and after viewings. Insurance requirements, mostly. But it's also become a habit that keeps me grounded in the routine of things. Mrs. Peterson had been a small woman, barely 5 feet tall and maybe 90 pounds soaking wet. Her mahogany casket was standard weight 147 pounds empty. With her body prepared and dressed, plus the silk lining and brass handles, we logged it at exactly 237 pounds before the family viewing began at 2 p.m. on Thursday. The viewing lasted 3 hours. Standard procedure. Families say their goodbyes, share memories, leave flowers or personal items if they choose. Mrs. Peterson's daughter brought a photo of their old golden retriever, Buster, to place in her mother's hands. Her son left his high school graduation program from 1993. Simple, meaningful gestures that help with closure. I always check the viewing rooms after families leave, making sure everything is secure before we move to the next phase. The casket was properly positioned, the flowers arranged neatly around the base. Everything appeared normal. I locked the prep room at 7:30 p.m. and went home to dinner with my wife. The next morning, Friday, I came in early to prepare Mrs. Peterson for transport to the crematory. That's when I noticed something off about the casket's position. It sat maybe 2 inches lower on the rolling cart than it had the night before. Not dramatically different, but enough to catch my eye after years of doing this work. I checked the hydraulics on the cart first, thinking maybe there was a leak in the system. Everything functioned normally. Then I decided to reweigh the casket before transport, just to be thorough in my documentation. 267 pounds. I stared at the digital readout for a full minute, thinking I'd made an error. I recalibrated the scale and weighed it again. 267 pounds. 30 pounds heavier than when we'd sealed it the day before. My first thought was that the Peterson family had returned during the night to add something significant, maybe more personal items, or jewelry they'd forgotten to include initially. But that didn't make sense. I was the only one with keys to the prep room, and our security system would have logged any after-hours entry. I called our security company and asked them to review the footage from Thursday evening through Friday morning. 20 minutes later, they called back with something that made my stomach drop. No one had entered or exited the prep room between 7:30 p.m. Thursday and 8:15 a.m. Friday when I arrived. The hallway cameras showed no movement, except for me locking up and returning the next morning. Yet somehow, 30 pounds had been added to that casket overnight. I spent the morning going through every logical explanation I could think of. Maybe the scale was malfunctioning, but it weighed everything else accurately. Maybe I'd written down the wrong initial weight. But I checked my log 3 times, 237 pounds, clearly documented in my handwriting. Maybe there was moisture buildup or temperature changes affecting the weight, but 30 pounds was far beyond any natural variation. The Peterson family arrived at 10 a.m. for the final viewing before cremation. I debated whether to mention the weight discrepancy, but decided against it. What would I say? That their mother's casket had mysteriously gained 30 pounds overnight? It would sound insane. Mrs. Peterson's daughter approached me, while her brother said his final goodbye. "Devon, I want to thank you for taking such good care of Mom. She looks peaceful." She paused, then added something that made my blood run cold. "You know, last night I had the strangest dream about her. She was trying to tell me she had company with her, that she wasn't alone anymore. It felt so real." I managed to nod and offer condolences, but her words echoed in my head as we moved the casket to the crematory. Company. She wasn't alone anymore. The cremation process went normally. Temperature reached the standard 1800 degrees. Timing followed protocol. But when I opened the retort chamber afterward, something was wrong with the remains. The volume seemed excessive for someone Mrs. Peterson's size. and scattered throughout the ash were small fragments that didn't look like bone. I've cremated hundreds of bodies over the years. I know what human remains look like after the process is complete. What I found in Mrs. Peterson's chamber looked like the ashes of two people, not one. I never filed a formal report about the weight discrepancy. How could I? There was no rational explanation that wouldn't make me sound mentally unstable. But I started weighing every casket twice now, before and after viewings, and documenting everything with photographs. 3 weeks later, the Morrison family held a viewing for their patriarch. Sealed casket, documented weight, locked prep room overnight. When I came in the next morning, that casket had also gained weight 24 pounds. The security footage showed no one entering the room. Mr. Morrison's widow mentioned a dream during the final viewing. Her husband had told her he was helping someone, that he'd found his purpose in the afterlife. I don't work late shifts anymore. I make sure every casket is transported immediately after viewings, no overnight storage in the prep rooms. My wife asks why I've become so particular about my schedule, why I seem distracted during dinner conversations. I tell her it's just the stress of the job, but the truth is more complicated than that. Sometimes I wonder if the dead aren't as alone as we think they are in those final hours before cremation. Sometimes I wonder if they're finding each other, keeping each other company in ways we can't understand. And sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I wonder what happens when it's my turn to lie in that prep room, waiting for morning. The sound started during Mrs. Caldwell's eulogy, a low humming that seemed to rise from the casket itself. I'm Chen, and I've been the funeral director at Harmony Memorial for 15 years. In all that time, I've heard every kind of sound a building can make: settling foundations, air conditioning units cycling, even the occasional mouse in the walls. But I'd never heard anything like the gentle, melodic humming that began emanating from Viewing Room 7 during Eleanor Caldwell's memorial service. Mrs. Caldwell had been 83 when she passed from pneumonia at Riverside Care Facility. Her daughter Jennifer lived in Oregon and had flown in to handle the arrangements. A simple woman with simple wishes, Mrs. Caldwell wanted a traditional viewing, closed casket, with cremation to follow. Nothing unusual about the arrangements or preparation. The service began at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. About 20 people attended, mostly residents from the care facility, a few neighbors, and Jennifer. Reverend Marshall conducted the service, reading from Psalms and sharing memories that Jennifer had provided about her mother's love for gardening and her habit of humming while she worked in her flower beds. That's when I first noticed the sound. It started quietly, so subtle that I initially thought it might be the air circulation system, or perhaps someone in the audience humming along with the Reverend's words. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the sound was coming from the front of the room, near Mrs. Caldwell's mahogany casket. The melody was hauntingly familiar, a simple, repetitive tune that seemed to weave through the Reverend's voice without disrupting his words. I found myself straining to identify it, thinking perhaps it was a hymn or lullaby I'd heard before. The sound had an intimate quality, like someone humming contentedly while engaged in a beloved task. I glanced around the room to see if anyone else was noticing, but the attendees seemed focused on the service. Jennifer sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with tissues, occasionally nodding as the Reverend spoke about her mother's gentle nature and love for music. After the service, as people filed out to share condolences and refreshments, I approached Jennifer carefully. "Your mother sounds like she was a wonderful woman. The Reverend mentioned she enjoyed music?" Jennifer smiled through her tears. "Oh yes, Mom was always humming. Even in her final days at the care facility, the nurses said she would hum these little melodies, old songs from her childhood, lullabies she used to sing to me when I was small. It drove some of the other residents crazy because she'd do it at all hours, but it seemed to comfort her." "Do you remember any particular songs she favored?" I asked, still puzzled by the melody I'd heard. "There was this one lullaby she sang constantly the last few months. I can't remember all the words, but the tune was so distinctive. She said her grandmother taught it to her in Polish when she was just a little girl. She'd hum it while doing dishes, working in her garden, even watching television. That evening, after all the guests had departed and the facility was quiet, I returned to viewing room 7 to prepare Mrs. Caldwell's casket for transport to the crematory the next morning. The room was dimly lit by the overhead track lighting we keep on during evening hours. As I approached the casket to check the floral arrangements, I heard it again. The same gentle humming, clearer now in the empty room. The melody was more distinct, without the background noise of conversation and movement. It seemed to emanate from within the casket itself, as if Mrs. Caldwell were lying there humming contentedly to herself. I stood perfectly still, barely breathing, listening to the tune repeat itself over and over. There was something deeply peaceful about it, yet profoundly unsettling at the same time. The melody had an old-world quality, the kind of song that carries the weight of generations. I checked all the mechanical systems, air conditioning, heating, electrical equipment. Everything was functioning normally. I examined the casket itself, looking for any loose hardware or structural issues that might create unusual sounds. Nothing. The humming continued. I called Jennifer that evening, apologizing for the late hour but explaining that I had a question about her mother. "You mentioned a Polish lullaby your mother used to hum. Could you sing a few bars for me? I think I may have heard something similar today." There was a pause. Then Jennifer's voice came through the phone, soft and slightly embarrassed. "I'm not much of a singer, but it went something like this." She hummed a gentle, repetitive melody that made my spine tingle with recognition. It was identical to what I'd heard in viewing room 7. "Jennifer, forgive me for asking, but are you anywhere near our facility right now? In town, perhaps?" "Oh no, Mr. Chen. I flew back to Oregon this afternoon. I'm actually in Portland right now, getting ready for bed." "Why do you ask?" After I hung up the phone, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the phone and trying to process what I'd experienced. Jennifer was 3 states away, yet somehow I'd heard her mother's distinctive lullaby coming from a sealed casket in an empty room. I decided to review the security footage from the service. Our cameras record both video and audio, primarily for insurance purposes. I fast-forwarded to the 2 p.m. service and watched the Reverend begin his remarks. At exactly 14 minutes and 37 seconds into the recording, the humming began. It was clearly audible on the audio track, a gentle melody that continued for nearly 3 minutes before fading away. The sound definitely originated from the area near the casket. But here's what disturbed me most. When I enhanced the audio and listened through headphones, I could hear not just the humming, but occasionally what sounded like whispered words in a language I didn't recognize. Polish words, perhaps, spoken in a voice that sounded remarkably like Jennifer's, except Jennifer had been 3,000 miles away when the recording was made. The next morning, we transported Mrs. Caldwell to the crematory. I accompanied the casket personally, something I don't usually do, but I felt compelled to see the process through. As the casket was moved into the retort chamber, I heard the humming one last time, fainter now, but still distinctly that same Polish lullaby. The crematory operator, a practical man named Davis, looked at me strangely when I asked if he'd heard anything unusual. "Just the normal sounds, Mr. Chen." "Why?" I never told him about the humming. 3 months later, I received a letter from Jennifer. She'd written to thank me again for handling her mother's services with such care and dignity. At the end of the letter, she mentioned something that made me save her words in my desk drawer. "I wanted you to know that since Mom's service, I've found myself humming that old Polish lullaby she taught me. It's strange I hadn't thought about that song in years, but now I catch myself humming it all the time, especially when I'm working in my garden. It feels like she's still with me somehow, teaching me the words I never learned as a child." I still work in viewing room 7 regularly, but I pay closer attention to the sounds now. Sometimes, during quiet moments between services, I think I can hear distant melodies floating through the rooms, fragments of songs that meant something to the people we've laid to rest. And sometimes I wonder if love really is stronger than death, expressing itself in the simple act of a grandmother's lullaby, sung across impossible distances by voices that refuse to be silenced. The call came in at 3:17 a.m., requesting pickup for a Mr. Harrison at Mercy Hospital, room 412. I'm Rick, and I've been driving transport for Greenwood Memorial Services for 8 years. Late-night calls aren't unusual in this business. People pass at all hours, and hospitals need the bodies moved quickly. But something about this particular call felt different from the moment I answered the phone. The voice was elderly, male, with a slight rasp that suggested years of smoking. He spoke clearly, despite the early hour. "This is Harrison. I need transport from Mercy Hospital to Greenwood Memorial. Room 412. It's time." I grabbed my clipboard and started taking down the details. "Mr. Harrison, I'll need to speak with the attending nurse or physician to confirm arrangements. Which unit are you calling from?" "Room 412. They know I'm here." "And the deceased's name for our paperwork?" There was a pause, then a sound that might have been a chuckle. "Harrison. Thomas Harrison. That's me." I assumed he was a family member handling arrangements for a relative with the same name. It happens more often than you'd think, sons named after fathers, that sort of thing. "I understand, Mr. Harrison. I'll head over to Mercy now and coordinate with the nursing staff. Should take me about 20 minutes. Thank you, son. I'll be waiting." The drive to Mercy Hospital was routine, empty roads, light traffic, the kind of peaceful early morning that makes you appreciate the quiet moments in this job. I've made this run hundreds of times over the years, and the hospital staff knows me well. Night shift nurses often have coffee ready when I arrive, understanding that we're all just trying to get through the long hours together. But when I walked up to the fourth-floor nurses' station, the charge nurse, Patricia, looked confused when I mentioned the Harrison pickup. "Harrison? Room 412? She checked her computer, scrolling through the patient list. "Rick, we don't have anyone by that name on this floor. Room 412 was discharged yesterday afternoon." I showed her my pickup sheet with the details I'd written down. "He called about 20 minutes ago, requesting transport to Greenwood Memorial. Said the hospital staff knew he was here." Patricia called down to the main desk and spoke with the night supervisor. After a few minutes of checking records and making calls, she hung up and shook her head. "Rick, there's no Thomas Harrison currently admitted to this hospital. In fact, our records show that a Thomas Harrison was here last week, but he died on Friday and his body was released to Miller Funeral Home for cremation." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Miller Funeral Home? Are you sure?" "Positive. I remember the case because Harrison didn't have any family listed. The county handled the cremation arrangements. It was completed Monday morning." I stared at my notes, written in my own handwriting. The pickup request, the room number, the name, all clearly documented from a phone conversation that had definitely happened. But according to hospital records, Thomas Harrison had been dead for 3 days and cremated 2 days ago. "Patricia, can you check what room Thomas Harrison was in when he died last week?" She pulled up the records again. "Room 412. I drove back to Greenwood Memorial in a daze, trying to make sense of what had happened. When I arrived, I immediately checked our phone logs to see if there was any record of the incoming call. Our system automatically logs all calls, with timestamps and caller ID information. The log showed a call received at 3:17 a.m. from a number I didn't recognize. When I dialed it back, I got a recorded message. The number you have dialed has been disconnected. I ran the number through our reverse directory service. It belonged to Thomas Harrison, with an address on Elm Street. The account had been closed on Friday, the same day Harrison died at Mercy Hospital. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened during that early morning call. I started researching Thomas Harrison, trying to understand who he was and why his death might have resulted in such an unusual experience. The obituary in the city newspaper was brief. Thomas Harrison, 73 years old, died peacefully at Mercy Hospital after a brief illness. No surviving family members were listed. Services were handled by the county, with cremation following immediately. But when I visited the Elm Street address listed in our directory search, I found a small apartment building with a landlord who remembered Harrison well. Tom was a good tenant for 12 years, Mrs. Kowalski told me. Quiet, always paid his rent on time, kept to himself mostly, but he was terrified of dying alone. He used to talk about it sometimes when I'd check on him. Said he'd seen too many people pass away with nobody to care, nobody to handle their affairs properly. She paused, looking thoughtful. He was always very specific about what he wanted when his time came. Had it all written down which funeral home to call, how he wanted to be transported, even which room at the hospital he wanted, if he had to be admitted. He was obsessed with the details, like he was afraid if he didn't plan everything perfectly, he'd be forgotten completely. I asked if she knew why Harrison had chosen Greenwood Memorial for his final arrangements. Oh, that's easy. Tom's wife was buried from Greenwood about 15 years ago, Sarah Harrison. He visited her grave every Sunday without fail until he got too sick to drive. Said when his time came, he wanted to go to the same place she did, wanted the same people to take care of him. That evening, I looked up Sarah Harrison's records in our files. She had indeed been interred through our services in 2008. The funeral was handled by my predecessor, but all the documentation was clear. Thomas Harrison had been the grieving widower who made all the arrangements. But here's what disturbed me most. According to Sarah's file, Thomas had specifically requested that if anything ever happened to him, Greenwood Memorial should handle his transport and services. He'd even prepaid for basic arrangements and left detailed instructions about notification procedures. Those instructions had never been followed because the hospital had no record of his connection to our funeral home. When he died alone with no family, the county stepped in and handled everything through their standard procedure with Miller Funeral Home. Thomas Harrison had planned meticulously for his death, but bureaucratic oversight had derailed every detail he'd carefully arranged. He died alone, been processed by strangers, and cremated without any of the dignity he'd tried so hard to secure for himself. I believe Thomas Harrison called me that night because he knew he'd been forgotten by the system he'd tried so hard to navigate. Somehow, he managed to reach out one last time, trying to set things right, trying to ensure that his final journey would be handled with the same care we'd shown his beloved wife. I never received another call from Thomas Harrison, but I started paying closer attention to our records, cross-referencing hospital notifications with our pre-need files. Twice since then, I've caught cases where people with existing arrangements at Greenwood were being processed elsewhere due to communication breakdowns. Each time, I made sure they got the services they'd planned for. I like to think Thomas would approve of that. I like to think he's resting easier now, knowing that other people won't slip through the cracks the way he did. And sometimes, when I'm driving those quiet early morning routes to pick up people who died alone, I remember his voice on the phone, grateful, patient, just wanting someone to care enough to show up when he called. That's what this job really is, in the end. Showing up when people call, even when the call comes from impossible places. The flowers appeared every morning for 6 months, though Plot 14B had no headstone, and our records showed it empty. I'm May, and I've been the groundskeeper at Restfield Cemetery for 22 years. In all that time, I've learned that people express grief in countless ways. Some visit daily with fresh flowers, others come once a year on significant dates, and some never return after the burial. But I'd never seen anything like what started happening at Plot 14B in Section 3. The flowers were always violets, arranged in a simple bouquet and placed precisely in the center of the unmarked plot. They appeared overnight, every single night, perfectly fresh as if they'd been cut from a garden moments before. Purple violets with bright green leaves, tied with a thin white ribbon that fluttered in the morning breeze. I noticed them first on a Tuesday in early March. My routine starts at sunrise, checking overnight irrigation, collecting any litter, and generally surveying the grounds before the day's maintenance work begins. Plot 14B sits in a quiet section near the older part of the cemetery, surrounded by graves from the 1930s and 40s. According to our burial records, the plot had been purchased in 1989 but never used. I assumed the flowers were a mistake. Maybe someone leaving tributes for a nearby grave and getting confused about the exact location. It happens more often than you'd think, especially in sections where headstones are weathered or missing. I collected the violets and disposed of them, making a mental note to check with the office about recent burial activity in that area. But the next morning, there were fresh violets in exactly the same spot. This continued daily for a week before I mentioned it to Janet, our cemetery administrator. She pulled up the records for Plot 14B and confirmed what I already knew. The plot was purchased decades ago by a woman named Margaret Chen, but no burial had ever taken place there. Margaret had paid for the plot in cash and provided a local address, but attempts to contact her over the years had been unsuccessful. Maybe it's Margaret herself, Janet suggested. People sometimes visit graves they've purchased for themselves, especially if they're elderly and thinking about final arrangements. I started arriving earlier, hoping to catch whoever was leaving the flowers. By 6 a.m. each morning, the violets were already there, perfectly arranged, completely fresh, as if they'd materialized during the darkest hours before dawn. I tried arriving at 5 a.m., then 4:30, but the pattern never changed. No matter how early I arrived, the flowers had already been placed. After 2 weeks of this routine, I decided to stake out the area overnight. I brought a lawn chair and thermos of coffee and positioned myself about 50 yards away, behind a large oak tree that provided cover, while giving me a clear view of Plot 14B. The night was unusually quiet, no wind, barely any traffic from the road that runs along the cemetery's eastern border. I settled in around 11 p.m., prepared to wait until sunrise if necessary. For hours, nothing happened. The empty plot remained empty, visible in the pale moonlight that filtered through the oak branches. At approximately 3:20 a.m., I saw movement near the plot. A figure approached from the direction of the older section, walking slowly along the gravel path that winds through Section 3. Even from 50 yards away, I could see it was a woman, elderly, wearing a dark coat that reached almost to her ankles. She carried something in her hands, though I couldn't make out details in the dim light. The woman stopped at Plot 14B and knelt down, placing what I now knew were violets in the center of the unmarked ground. She remained kneeling for several minutes, and though I couldn't hear her words, it appeared she was speaking quietly to the empty grave. I decided to approach her, thinking perhaps she was confused about the location of a loved one's burial site. I stood up from my chair and walked toward the plot, trying to make noise with my footsteps so I wouldn't startle her. "Excuse me, ma'am, can I help you find someone?" The woman looked up at me, and I stopped walking. Her face was clearly visible in the moonlight, an elderly Asian woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore wire-rimmed glasses and had the kind of gentle expression you see in old family photographs. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said in accented English. "This is my place." "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion. This plot doesn't have anyone buried in it. Are you looking for someone in particular?" She smiled sadly and stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. Not looking, waiting. Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and walked back toward the older section of the cemetery. I followed at a distance, but when she reached the intersection of two paths near Section 2, she simply wasn't there anymore. I searched the immediate area, checking behind headstones and monuments, but found no trace of her. The next morning, fresh violets were in place at Plot 14B. I spent the following day researching Margaret Chen, the woman who had purchased the plot in 1989. City records showed an address on Maple Street, but when I drove by, the house number led to a vacant lot. The city planning office confirmed that several houses on Maple Street had been demolished in the early 1990s to make way for a shopping complex that was never built. A search through old phone directories revealed a Margaret Chen at that Maple Street address, but the trail went cold after 1991. No death certificate, no forwarding address, no family contacts in our records. But I did find something else. The local newspaper archive contained a brief article from September 1991 about a hit-and-run accident on Route 12 near the entrance to Restfield Cemetery. The victim was an elderly woman who had been walking along the roadside at approximately 3 a.m. She died at the scene from injuries sustained when a vehicle struck her and fled. The woman was never identified, but witnesses described finding scattered purple violets at the scene flowers she had apparently been carrying when she was killed. The date of the accident was exactly 6 months after Margaret Chen's last recorded address appeared in the city directory. I stopped collecting the flowers from plot 14B. Every morning, I found fresh violets arranged with care on the empty ground, and every morning I left them undisturbed. The pattern continued for 6 months total, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. On the last morning, when flowers appeared, a Tuesday in early September, I found not just violets, but a small envelope tucked beneath the bouquet. Inside was a brief handwritten note in neat script. "Thank you for letting me wait. I can rest now." The flowers never returned after that. 3 weeks later, Janet received a call from an attorney in San Francisco, representing the estate of Margaret Chen, who had recently passed away in California. Margaret had left specific instructions that her body be transported to Restfield Cemetery for burial in Plot 14B, which she had purchased more than 30 years earlier. Margaret Chen was buried on a Thursday morning in October. As we lowered her casket into the ground she had visited for 6 months, I noticed something that made me pause. The funeral director had arranged a spray of flowers on top of the casket, purple violets with bright green leaves, tied with a thin white ribbon. I never told the family about the flowers that had appeared on their loved one's grave before she was actually buried there. Some things are too strange to explain and too beautiful to question. But sometimes, when I'm working in Section 3 during the early morning hours, I think about Margaret Chen and her patient vigil. I think about love that transcends death and hope that transcends understanding. And I always make sure Plot 14B is well tended, in case anyone else needs a place to wait. The antique bell began ringing during Mr. Henderson's eulogy, though he'd been dead for 3 days. I'm Jules, and I've worked as a mortician at Willow Creek Memorial for 19 years. Last summer, as part of our historical preservation project, we restored several antique caskets from the 1800s that had been donated by local families. These caskets featured something modern funeral services have long since abandoned: safety bells connected to pull cords inside the casket, designed to alert cemetery workers if someone had been accidentally buried alive. The practice fell out of use by the early 1900s once embalming became standard. But the mechanisms fascinated me from a historical perspective. We installed the restored caskets as educational displays in our heritage room, complete with working bell systems to demonstrate how the safety measures functioned in an era when medical determination of death was less precise than it is today. When the Henderson family requested a traditional service with period authenticity to honor their grandfather's love of history, I suggested they might appreciate using one of our restored 1875 caskets for the viewing. Harold Henderson had been a retired history professor who specialized in 19th century American life, and his family thought he would have loved the historical significance of the casket choice. I prepared Mr. Henderson's body with the same care I apply to all our services: proper embalming, cosmetic restoration, and dignified positioning. He had died peacefully in his sleep at age 87 after a brief illness. The embalming process was routine, completed on Friday morning for a Monday afternoon service. The restored casket was beautiful solid walnut, with brass fittings and a deep burgundy velvet interior. The safety bell mechanism was fully functional, connected by a cord that ran from inside the casket to a bronze bell mounted on a stand beside the head of the casket. We'd tested the system during restoration to ensure it worked properly for demonstration purposes. During the viewing hours before the service, several visitors commented on the historical casket choice, and I found myself explaining the safety bell system multiple times. Professor Henderson's colleagues from the university were particularly interested in the mechanical aspects and the social history it represented. The memorial service began at 2 p.m. on Monday, with about 60 people in attendance. Professor Henderson had been well loved in the academic community, and the service reflected his passion for teaching and historical research. His son gave a touching eulogy about his father's dedication to preserving and sharing knowledge about the past. That's when the bell began to ring. It started during the middle of the son's speech, a clear, metallic chiming that caused heads to turn throughout the chapel. The sound was unmistakably coming from the bronze bell beside Mr. Henderson's casket, though no one was near enough to have touched the mechanism. I immediately assumed there was a mechanical issue with the restoration, perhaps a loose connection or settling of the internal mechanisms causing the cord to pull. I quietly moved toward the casket to investigate, but as I approached, the ringing stopped. The son paused in his eulogy, clearly distracted by the interruption, but I gestured for him to continue and stepped back to my position at the rear of the chapel. Within moments, the bell began ringing again, not random chimes, but a deliberate pattern of 3 rings, followed by a pause, then 3 more rings. This continued for nearly a minute before stopping again. After the service, as guests moved to the fellowship hall for refreshments, I examined the bell mechanism carefully. The cord appeared to be in perfect condition, properly tensioned, and correctly connected to the internal pull system. I tested the mechanism by gently pulling the cord from inside the casket. It worked exactly as designed, producing the same clear chimes we'd heard during the service. But here's what disturbed me. When I opened the casket to inspect the internal connection, I noticed that Mr. Henderson's right hand was positioned slightly differently than I remembered from my final positioning on Friday morning. His arm appeared to have moved closer to where the pull cord would be accessible inside the casket. I convinced myself I was misremembering the exact positioning. After 19 years of doing this work, I've learned that memory can play tricks when you're dealing with unusual circumstances. But I made detailed photographs of the body's position before closing the casket for transport to the cemetery. That evening, I reviewed our security footage from the memorial service. Our cameras record both the chapel and the preparation areas for insurance and security purposes. The footage clearly showed the bell ringing during the eulogy, but what I saw next made me question everything I thought I knew about death and consciousness. The camera angle captured both the bell and the head of the closed casket. At exactly 2:37 p.m., during the first episode of ringing, there was visible movement of the cord where it disappeared into the casket. The cord pulled taut, released, then pulled again in the precise pattern we'd heard in the chapel. Someone or something inside that sealed casket was deliberately pulling the safety cord. I enhanced the footage and watched it frame by frame. The movement was unmistakable and rhythmic, not the random motion you might expect from settling or mechanical failure. The cord was being pulled with purpose in that same pattern of 3 rings. Pause. 3 rings. But Professor Henderson had been dead for 3 days. I had embalmed him myself, following standard procedures that ensure complete preservation and eliminate any possibility of mistaken death. There was no medical scenario that could explain conscious movement after that length of time and chemical treatment. I called Dr. Martinez, our consulting physician, who handles death certifications, and described the situation without mentioning the supernatural implications. He confirmed what I already knew after proper embalming. Any reflexive muscle movement becomes impossible. The chemical process prevents exactly the kind of coordinated action I'd witnessed on the security footage. The next morning, I received a phone call from Professor Henderson's son, David. He wanted to share something that had happened during the night after the memorial service. Jules, I had the strangest experience last night. I was lying in bed around 2:30 in the morning when I heard a sound that reminded me of my father's old desk bell. You know, the one he used to ring when he wanted to get his students' attention during lectures? It was the same pattern he always used, 3 rings to call the class to order. David paused, and I could hear him struggling with whether to continue. The thing is, that desk bell is in a storage unit across town. Has been for 2 years since we cleaned out his office at the university. But I swear I heard it last night coming from somewhere in the house. When I got up to investigate, the sound stopped. I asked David if he could describe the timing of the rings. 3 rings, then a pause, then 3 more. Dad always did that. Said it was more effective than just ringing continuously. Gets people's attention without being obnoxious. He was very particular about it. After I hung up, I sat in my office staring at the photographs I'd taken of Mr. Henderson's body position. In the photos taken before the service, his right hand rested naturally across his chest, fingers slightly curved. In the photos taken afterward, his hand had clearly moved several inches toward the area where the pull cord was located inside the casket. I've never told the Henderson family about the security footage or the evidence of movement I documented. How could I explain that their beloved patriarch had somehow managed to ring a bell from inside his sealed casket, using a system designed to save the accidentally buried alive? But I started researching Professor Henderson's academic work, thinking perhaps there was something in his scholarly interests that might explain his apparent attachment to the historical casket and its safety mechanism. What I found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Professor Henderson had spent the last 5 years of his career researching premature burial in the 19th century, particularly the psychological and social factors that led to the widespread adoption of safety coffins. His final published paper, completed just months before his death, was titled Consciousness and Crisis: The Fear of Premature Interment in Victorian America. In that paper, he argued that the safety bell represented more than just a mechanical device. It was a symbol of humanity's deep-seated fear of being forgotten, abandoned, or left to die alone and unheard. He theorized that the bells provided psychological comfort, not just to those being buried, but to the living who feared their own eventual helplessness. The paper concluded with a passage that I've read dozens of times since discovering it. Perhaps the true value of the safety bell lies not in its practical application, but in its representation of our fundamental need to be heard, to have our presence acknowledged, even in our most vulnerable moments. The bell becomes a voice for the voiceless, a final opportunity to call out to the world of the living and say, I am still here. I still matter. I never installed another safety bell system in any of our caskets, antique or otherwise. The historical display remains in our heritage room, but the bell mechanism has been permanently disconnected. Yet, sometimes, during quiet evening hours, when I'm working alone in the preparation rooms, I think I hear distant chiming, echoing through the building. It's always the same pattern: 3 rings, pause, 3 rings, like someone trying to get my attention, trying to remind me that they're still there, still waiting to be heard. I never answer those bells. Some calls, I've learned, are too dangerous to return, but I listen to them. And I remember Professor Henderson's words about the need to be acknowledged, even in our most vulnerable moments. And I make sure that every person who comes through our doors receives the dignity and attention they deserve, while I still have the chance to hear them. The woman in the blue coat appeared on our security cameras every night at 11:47 p.m., leaving origami cranes on graves throughout the cemetery. I'm Tomas, and I've been the night security guard at Hillside Memorial Park for 6 years. The job is usually quiet, checking gates, monitoring the grounds, and making sure no vandals or trespassers disturb the peace of the cemetery after hours. Most nights, the only movement on our surveillance system comes from raccoons, the occasional deer, or cats that hunt in the gardens around the older sections. But starting in late October, something changed in our nightly routine. It began with the origami cranes. Each morning, the groundskeeping crew would find delicate paper birds placed on various graves throughout the cemetery, never in large numbers, maybe 5 or 6 each night, but always carefully positioned on headstones or tucked into flower arrangements. The cranes were beautifully crafted, folded from different types of paper, some from newspaper, others from colorful gift wrap, and occasionally from what appeared to be pages torn from books. The ground supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, initially thought the cranes were being left by visiting family members during regular hours, perhaps part of some cultural or personal tradition. But after 2 weeks of finding them consistently each morning, she asked me to review the security footage to see if I could identify who was leaving them. That's when I first saw the woman in the blue coat. She appeared on camera 7 at exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in early November. The timestamp never varied, always 11:47, down to the minute. She walked slowly through the main entrance, which should have been locked, though our sensors showed no breach of security. The woman appeared to be elderly, wearing a long blue wool coat and carrying a small bag or purse. Over the course of an hour, she moved methodically through different sections of the cemetery, pausing at various graves to place origami cranes. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, following paths with purpose rather than wandering randomly. At each stop, she would kneel beside a headstone, place a crane carefully, and remain motionless for a few moments as if paying respects. The woman appeared on 4 different cameras as she moved through the cemetery, always clearly visible despite the nighttime lighting. But here's what disturbed me most. When I tried to approach her location during one of these visits, I found the cemetery completely empty, except for the freshly placed cranes. I started monitoring the cameras more carefully each night, watching for the 11:47 appearance. The pattern never changed. Same time, same blue coat, same methodical placement of origami cranes. But when I would leave the security office to patrol the areas where she appeared on camera, I never encountered her physically. After a month of this routine, I decided to research the graves where she left the cranes, thinking perhaps there was a connection that would explain her nightly visits. What I discovered was both fascinating and impossible. The woman visited graves spanning 60 years of burials, from the 1930s through the 1990s. There was no apparent pattern based on age, gender, or family connections. But when I cross-referenced the names with old cemetery records and newspaper obituaries, I found something significant. Every single grave belonged to someone who had died alone. Mrs. Chen, in Section B, who passed away in her apartment and wasn't found for 3 days. Mr. Rodriguez, in Section F, a veteran who died in the county hospital with no family present. Miss Patterson, in Section A, no relation to our ground supervisor, who died in 1943 when her fiancé was overseas during the war. Each person the woman visited had died without loved ones nearby, people whose final moments were marked by solitude rather than comfort. I started staying later into the night, determined to make contact with this mysterious visitor. On a Thursday in December, I positioned myself near Section B, where she frequently appeared, hiding behind a large memorial monument with a clear view of the area. At 11:47 p.m. exactly, she appeared at the entrance to Section B. In person, she looked even more elderly than she had on camera, probably in her 80s, with silver hair pulled back under a dark blue hat that matched her coat. She moved slowly but steadily, carrying a cloth bag that rustled softly as she walked. I watched her approach Mrs. Chen's grave and kneel down to place an origami crane made from what looked like sheet music. She remained kneeling for several minutes, and I could see her lips moving as if she were speaking quietly to the headstone. I decided to approach her gently, not wanting to startle an elderly woman in a cemetery at midnight. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm Tomas, the security guard here. Can I help you with anything?" She looked up at me with clear, dark eyes and smiled. "Oh, hello, dear. I'm just visiting friends. They get lonely, you know." "Ma'am, visiting hours end at sunset. The cemetery is closed to the public after dark. How did you get inside?" She stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. "I've been coming here for a very long time. I know my way around. Can I ask why you leave the origami cranes? They're beautiful, but the grounds crew has been wondering about them." Her smile became sad, and she looked back at Mrs. Chen's headstone. "Agnes taught me how to fold them years ago. Said they were symbols of peace and healing. I leave them for the people who don't get visitors, who don't have family to remember them." She paused, then added quietly, "I know what it feels like to be forgotten." "Agnes? Agnes who?" "Agnes Mueller. She's been resting in Section C for 15 years now. Sweet woman used to volunteer at the children's hospital, teaching origami to the young patients. She said the cranes carried wishes for healing and hope." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Ma'am, what's your name?" She looked at me with those clear, dark eyes, and for a moment her face seemed to flicker, like looking at someone through heat waves rising from summer pavement. "I'm Agnes," she said softly. "Agnes Mueller." Before I could respond, she turned and walked toward the path leading to Section C. I followed, but when I reached the intersection of paths near the older part of the cemetery, she had vanished completely. The next morning, I looked up Agnes Mueller in our burial records. Section C, plot number 147, died in January 2008 at the age of 79. The obituary mentioned her volunteer work at Children's Memorial Hospital, where she taught origami to pediatric patients as part of the art therapy program. Agnes Mueller had been wearing a blue wool coat when she was buried, according to the funeral director's notes. Her family had chosen the coat because she'd worn it every day during her final winter, saying it kept her warm during her hospital visits. I never approached the woman in the blue coat again, though she continued appearing on our security cameras for 3 more months. The origami cranes kept appearing each morning. Newspaper cranes for people who died forgotten by the world. Gift wrap cranes for those who'd missed holidays with family. And music sheet cranes for those who died in silence. The visits stopped in late March, as suddenly as they'd begun. The last crane I found was placed on Agnes Mueller's own grave, folded from a page of poetry that included these words: "Though we travel beyond the sight of others, love finds a way to bridge even the longest distances." I kept that crane on my desk in the security office for the rest of my tenure at Hillside Memorial. It reminded me that this job is about more than just watching empty grounds. It's about protecting a place where love persists beyond death, where the forgotten are remembered, and where someone always comes to visit, even if they have to find their own way back from impossible places. Sometimes I still think I see a figure in a blue coat moving through the cemetery in my peripheral vision, but when I look directly, there's nothing there except the wind moving through the trees, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that no one rests completely alone. The reflections in the preparation room mirror sometimes showed the deceased with their eyes open, even when their physical bodies remained unchanged. I'm Sarah, and I've worked as an embalmer at Valley View Funeral Home for 13 years. The job requires precision, respect, and the ability to work alone for long hours in quiet spaces. Over the years, I've developed routines that help me maintain both technical excellence and emotional equilibrium while caring for the deceased and their families. The preparation room, where I do most of my work, has a large mirror mounted on the east wall, positioned to provide optimal lighting and multiple viewing angles while I work. The mirror is practical. It allows me to see details from different perspectives and ensure that my cosmetic work appears natural from every angle. But 6 months ago, that mirror started showing me things that shouldn't have been possible. It began with Mrs. Garrett, an 81-year-old woman who had passed peacefully in her sleep after a long struggle with heart disease. Her family requested a natural, restful appearance for the viewing, emphasizing that they wanted her to look as if she were simply sleeping. I began the embalming process on a Tuesday morning, following standard procedures for someone of her age and medical history. Mrs. Garrett's preparation went smoothly. The embalming fluid circulated properly. Her features responded well to cosmetic treatment, and her positioning appeared natural and dignified. But as I worked on the final details of her appearance, I noticed something odd in the mirror's reflection. While Mrs. Garrett's physical body lay peacefully with eyes closed, her reflection in the mirror showed her eyes slightly open, as if she were looking directly at me. I assumed it was an optical illusion caused by the lighting angle, or perhaps fatigue, affecting my perception. I checked Mrs. Garrett's physical appearance directly. Her eyes were definitely closed, properly positioned with the attention to detail her family had requested. But when I glanced back at the mirror, the reflection continued to show her eyes open, watching. This continued throughout the rest of my work session. No matter how many times I checked Mrs. Garrett's actual appearance, her reflection maintained that subtle but unmistakable gaze. I finished her preparation without looking at the mirror again, focusing entirely on the direct visual assessment of my work. The viewing went well. Mrs. Garrett's family was pleased with her appearance, commenting on how peaceful and natural she looked. Several relatives mentioned that she appeared to be simply sleeping, exactly as they had hoped. No one noticed anything unusual about her appearance or positioning. But I couldn't shake the memory of those watching eyes in the mirror's reflection. 2 weeks later, I was preparing Mr. Davidson, a 47-year-old man who had died suddenly from a heart attack while playing softball with his company team. His case was emotionally challenging because of his young age and the shock of his unexpected death. But the preparation itself was technically routine. As I worked on Mr. Davidson's facial features, trying to restore the natural appearance his wife remembered, I found myself unconsciously avoiding the mirror. When I finally did glance at the reflection to check my progress, I saw Mr. Davidson's eyes open in the mirror, looking directly at me with an expression that seemed almost questioning. His physical body remained exactly as I had positioned it, eyes closed, features peaceful. But his reflection showed someone very much awake and aware. This pattern continued with every case over the following months. Regardless of age, cause of death, or length of time since passing, every person I prepared showed the same phenomenon in the mirror, eyes open in the reflection, while remaining closed on their physical form. The reflected gazes weren't threatening or frightening exactly, but they were intensely present, as if each person were trying to communicate something important. I started working with my back to the mirror whenever possible, but the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. Even when I couldn't see the reflections directly, I could sense them a weight of attention that made the preparation room feel crowded with unseen presence. The situation reached a crisis point during the preparation of Jennifer Walsh, a 23-year-old nursing student who had died in a car accident on her way home from a late shift at the hospital. Jennifer's case was particularly difficult because of her youth and the fact that she had dedicated her short life to caring for others. As I worked on repairing the damage from her injuries, trying to restore her appearance for her devastated parents, I became aware of an unusual intensity in the room. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, but when I glanced at the mirror, I saw something that nearly made me stop working entirely. Jennifer's reflection showed not just open eyes, but a slight smile, as if she were trying to offer comfort or reassurance. Her physical expression remained serene and unchanged, but her reflection seemed to radiate warmth and peace. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jennifer's reflected smile and wondering what message she might have been trying to convey. The next morning, I received a call from her mother, Mrs. Walsh. "Sarah, I wanted to thank you for your beautiful work with Jennifer. When we saw her yesterday, she looked so peaceful, so much like herself. But there was something else. She looked like she was dreaming about something wonderful. My husband and I both felt like she was somehow still with us, still trying to take care of everyone else, even in death. Mrs. Walsh's words stayed with me as I continued to work with subsequent cases. I began to pay closer attention to the reflected expressions I saw in the mirror, and I noticed something remarkable. Each reflection seemed to show the deceased as they truly were in life, their essential personality, their core nature, somehow visible despite the physical limitations of death. Mr. Patterson, a retired teacher, showed curiosity and gentle intelligence in his reflection. Mrs. Chen, who had volunteered at an animal shelter for 30 years, reflected kindness and compassion. Young Timothy Brooks, who had died in a skateboarding accident, showed the mischievous grin his friends had described during the funeral planning. I realized that the mirror wasn't showing me something supernatural or frightening. It was revealing the enduring essence of each person I prepared, the part of them that transcended physical death. The open eyes in the reflections weren't watching me with judgment or fear, but with gratitude and recognition. I stopped avoiding the mirror during my work. Instead, I began to acknowledge what I saw there, speaking quietly to the reflections as I completed each preparation. I see you, Mrs. Rodriguez. I'm taking good care of you. You can rest now, Mr. Thompson. Your family will remember you exactly as you were. The reflected gazes began to feel less like scrutiny and more like partnership, as if each person were helping me understand how to honor their memory most effectively. 3 months ago, the mirror was accidentally broken during a renovation project. We replaced it with an identical model, same size and positioning, but the new mirror shows only standard reflections, accurate images of physical reality, without the deeper glimpses I had grown accustomed to seeing. I missed those reflected conversations more than I expected. Working alone in the preparation room feels truly solitary now, without the sense of presence and partnership that had developed over those strange months. But I carry the experience with me in every case I handle, remembering that my work serves not just the grieving families, but the enduring spirits of those who have passed. Sometimes I wonder if the original mirror had some unique property that allowed it to reveal hidden truths, or if perhaps I had simply learned to see with different eyes during that period. Either way, I approach each preparation with greater awareness now, knowing that the people I care for may be more present and aware than physical death would suggest. And sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I still catch glimpses of watching eyes and grateful smiles, reminding me that this work is about more than preserving bodies. It's about honoring souls. Every burial in Lot 33 resulted in families reporting the same disturbing dream, their loved one begging to be moved. I'm Banks, and I've been the director at Meadowbrook Memorial Gardens for 18 years. In that time, I've overseen hundreds of burials and helped countless families through their most difficult moments. But I've never encountered anything like the pattern that emerged around Lot 33 in our eastern section. The lot consists of 12 burial plots arranged in a neat rectangle near the older part of the cemetery, surrounded by mature oak trees that provide natural beauty and peaceful shade. From a practical standpoint, it's prime cemetery real estate, well-drained soil, attractive landscaping, and easy access for visitors. We've never had trouble selling plots in that area. The problems began after our first burial there, in March of last year. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman was interred in plot 33A on a quiet Tuesday morning. She'd been 92 when she passed from natural causes, and her funeral was a celebration of a life well lived. Her daughter, Patricia, chose the location because Eleanor had always loved sitting under oak trees in the park near her childhood home. 3 days after the burial, Patricia called our office in distress. "Mr. Banks, I need to ask you something. That's going to sound crazy, but I have to know. Is there any way my mother could be moved to a different location?" I assumed she was having second thoughts about the plot selection, which happens occasionally when families have time to process their decisions. "Of course, Patricia. May I ask what's prompting the request? I've had the same dream 3 nights in a row. My mother is calling to me, telling me she needs to leave that place. She seems frightened, desperate to get away from something. I know it sounds ridiculous, but the dreams feel so real, so urgent. Patricia's request was unusual but not unprecedented. Grief can manifest in many ways, including vivid dreams that feel like communication with the deceased. I arranged for Mrs. Hoffman's remains to be relocated to a plot in our western section, and Patricia seemed relieved by the change. I thought that would be the end of it, but over the following months, every family who buried a loved one in Lot 33 reported similar experiences. Mr. James Morrison was buried in Plot 33D in April. Within a week, his son called asking about relocation, describing dreams where his father pleaded to be moved away from the others who wouldn't let him rest. Mrs. Sarah Chen was interred in Plot 33F in May. Her husband reported nightmares where Sarah begged him to take her somewhere safe, somewhere the watching eyes couldn't find her. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. Families would choose Lot 33 for its beauty and peaceful setting, but within days of burial, relatives would begin experiencing dreams where their loved ones expressed fear, desperation, and urgent requests to be moved elsewhere. By August, we had buried 6 people in Lot 33, and all 6 families had requested relocations after reporting identical dream experiences. The dreams always featured the deceased pleading to be moved, expressing fear of something in that location, and conveying a sense of being trapped or watched by malevolent presences. I decided to research the history of that particular area of the cemetery, thinking perhaps there was some forgotten tragedy or cultural significance that might explain the family's experiences. What I discovered in the county historical records made my blood run cold. Meadowbrook Memorial Gardens was established in 1953 on land that had previously housed the Riverside State Hospital, a psychiatric facility that operated from 1897 until 1949. The hospital had been demolished before our cemetery was developed, but the architectural plans I found in the county archives showed something deeply unsettling. Lot 33 sat directly over what had been the hospital's isolation ward, a building specifically designed to house patients considered dangerous to themselves or others. But even more disturbing was the specific location within that building. Lot 33 occupied the exact footprint of the solitary confinement cells, where the most severely disturbed patients had been kept in individual isolation for weeks or months at a time. According to hospital records, 12 patients had died in those solitary cells. Over the 52 years, the facility operated deaths attributed to various causes, but all occurring in isolation, often after extended periods of confinement. The patients who died there had been buried in unmarked graves in a potter's field that was later developed into a shopping complex on the other side of town. When I cross-referenced the burial dates in Lot 33 with the death dates from the hospital records, I discovered something that made me immediately suspend sales in that section. Mrs. Hoffman had been buried in the exact location where Emma Hartwell, a patient with severe depression, had died alone in solitary confinement in 1923. Mr. Morrison's plot corresponded to where Thomas Bradley, diagnosed with what we would now call schizophrenia, had died in isolation in 1931. Each burial plot in Lot 33 aligned precisely with a solitary confinement cell where a patient had died alone and afraid. The families weren't just reporting random nightmares. They were somehow experiencing the fear and desperation of patients who had died in that exact location decades earlier. Patients who had been forgotten and unmarked, their remains relocated without ceremony or recognition. I faced an impossible decision. How could I explain to families that their loved ones were buried over the sites where mentally ill patients had died in isolation? How could I validate their dream experiences without sounding delusional myself? And what responsibility did we have to address a situation that defied rational explanation? I chose disclosure and action. I contacted each family who had buried someone in Lot 33 and explained what I had discovered about the site's history. Rather than dismissing their dreams as grief-induced hallucinations, I acknowledged that their experiences might be connected to the unresolved trauma of the location itself. Every family requested immediate relocation of their loved ones' remains. But I also felt a responsibility to the forgotten patients whose deaths had been overlooked and unmarked for decades. Working with the County Historical Society and local mental health advocacy groups, we organized a memorial service for the 12 patients who had died in the solitary confinement cells beneath Lot 33. We installed a memorial plaque acknowledging their lives and deaths, and we consecrated the area as a memorial garden rather than continuing to use it for burials. Local religious leaders from multiple faiths participated in a blessing ceremony designed to bring peace to the troubled location. The dream reports stopped after the memorial service. Lot 33 now serves as a quiet memorial garden where visitors can reflect on the importance of mental health awareness and the dignity of all human life. The oak trees provide shade for benches where people sit and contemplate the complex history of the land beneath their feet. But I learned something profound from that experience about the lasting impact of trauma and the importance of acknowledging those who have been forgotten. The earth remembers what we choose to forget, and sometimes the dead cannot rest until their stories are heard and honored. I've changed how we research new cemetery locations, always investigating the complete history of the land we're developing. And I pay closer attention when families report unusual experiences after burials, understanding now that grief can sometimes open doorways to deeper truths about the places where we lay our loved ones to rest. Some ground is too troubled for new burials, too saturated with old pain to provide the peace that families seek for their loved ones. But with proper acknowledgement and respect, even the most disturbed places can find healing, becoming memorials to both the remembered and the forgotten, the celebrated and the overlooked. The dead deserve peace, all of them, regardless of how or where they died. Sometimes our job as funeral directors extends beyond serving the living to include honoring the forgotten dead, whose stories still echo in the places they left behind. The memorial service audio contained whispered Polish prayers layered beneath the English eulogy, spoken by a woman who had been dead for 20 years. I'm Rivera, and I've been the sound technician at Sacred Heart Memorial Chapel for 9 years. My job involves recording memorial services for families who want audio keepsakes of the ceremonies, as well as live streaming services for relatives who cannot attend in person. The work requires attention to detail and sensitivity to the emotional significance of these recordings for grieving families. The Kowalski Memorial Service was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in late November. Mrs. Anna Kowalski had passed away at age 78 after a brief battle with cancer. Her son Michael had arranged a traditional Catholic service with English and Polish elements to honor his mother's heritage and accommodate both her immigrant generation and her American-born descendants. I arrived early to set up the recording equipment, positioning microphones to capture both the priest's remarks and any family members who might speak during the service. Mrs. Kowalski's son had specifically requested a high-quality recording because several elderly relatives from Poland would not be able to travel for the funeral. The service began at 2 p.m., with Father Martinez conducting the ceremony in English, with Michael translating key elements into Polish for the older attendees who were more comfortable in their native language. About 40 people attended, representing 3 generations of the Kowalski family and their close friends from the local Polish-American community. Everything proceeded normally during the recording. Father Martinez delivered a thoughtful homily about Mrs. Kowalski's devotion to her family and her faith. Michael spoke movingly about his mother's immigration to America in the 1960s and her determination to preserve Polish traditions while embracing her new country. Several family members shared memories in both English and Polish. I monitored the audio levels throughout the service, ensuring clear recording quality for the family's keepsake. The sound was clean and well balanced, with no technical issues or background interference. After the service concluded, I packed up my equipment and returned to the studio to process the recording. That evening, I began editing the audio file to remove any technical glitches and enhance the overall sound quality. As I listened through headphones to review the recording, I noticed something unusual during Father Martinez's opening prayers. Beneath his clear English words, I could hear what sounded like whispered prayers in Polish. A woman's voice speaking so quietly that it was almost subliminal, but definitely present in the audio track. The whispered words seemed to follow the rhythm of the priest's prayers, as if someone were translating or echoing his remarks in real time. I initially assumed the whispers came from one of the elderly Polish attendees praying along with the service. This happens frequently in multicultural religious services, and it usually adds a beautiful layered quality to the recording. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the whispered prayers weren't following the priest's words, they were preceding them. The Polish whispers would begin several seconds before Father Martinez spoke each prayer, as if anticipating his words rather than responding to them. Moreover, the voice was clear and distinct despite being whispered, with no background noise or echo that would indicate it came from the chapel microphones. I enhanced the audio and isolated the frequency range where the whispered prayers appeared. What I heard made me pause the editing session and listen again from the beginning. The whispered voice was reciting traditional Polish Catholic prayers. Prayers I recognized from previous Polish-American services I had recorded, but the timing was impossible. The voice would begin each prayer 3 to 5 seconds before Father Martinez began the corresponding English version, as if prompting him or providing him with spiritual guidance. The next morning, I called Michael Kowalski to ask about the Polish elements of the service. "Michael, I'm working on editing your mother's memorial recording, and I wanted to confirm something about the Polish prayers. Was there an elderly relative who was praying along in Polish during Father Martinez's remarks?" "Not that I noticed," Michael replied. "Most of the older relatives just listened quietly. My Aunt Helena whispered a few responses, but she was sitting in the back and spoke very softly. Can you help me identify some of the Polish prayers I'm hearing in the recording? I want to make sure I'm preserving them appropriately in the final mix." Michael agreed to come to the studio that afternoon to listen to the relevant sections. When I played the enhanced audio for him, focusing on the whispered Polish prayers, his reaction was immediate and emotional. "That's my babcia," he said quietly, using the Polish word for grandmother. "That's my grandmother's voice." "Your grandmother? Was she at the service?" Michael looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "My babcia died 20 years ago, but those are definitely her prayers she used to recite them every night before bed when I was a child. I'd know her voice anywhere." I played the recording again, and Michael listened intently, occasionally translating the Polish words. "She's praying for safe passage to heaven, for God's mercy and protection. These are the exact prayers she taught my mother when Mom was a little girl in Poland." "Michael, I need to ask you something directly. Are you absolutely certain this is your grandmother's voice?" He nodded without hesitation. "I lived with my babcia for 2 years when I was in college. I heard these prayers every single night. She had a very distinctive way of pronouncing certain words. She never lost her village accent, even after 50 years in America. This is definitely her voice." I spent the next hour analyzing the recording with professional audio software, looking for any technical explanation for the phenomenon. The whispered prayers appeared on all microphone channels simultaneously, suggesting the sound had filled the entire chapel space rather than originating from a specific location. The frequency analysis showed the voice had the characteristics of someone speaking directly into a microphone, despite no one being positioned near our recording equipment during those moments. Most disturbing was the timing analysis. The Polish prayers consistently began 3 to 7 seconds before Father Martinez spoke the corresponding English prayers. There was no way anyone in the chapel could have anticipated his exact words and timing, yet the whispered voice seemed to be guiding or prompting the entire service. That weekend, I decided to research Mrs. Kowalski's family history, thinking perhaps there was some detail that might explain the presence of her mother's voice at the memorial service. Michael had mentioned that his grandmother had been deeply religious and very close to his mother throughout her life. What I discovered added another layer of mystery to the recording. According to the obituary records I found, Michael's grandmother, Helena Kowalski, had died exactly 20 years ago on the same date as Mrs. Anna Kowalski's memorial service, November 21st. The anniversary was so precise that Mrs. Kowalski's memorial had been scheduled exactly 20 years to the day after her mother's death. When I called Michael to ask about this coincidence, his voice became very quiet. "I didn't realize you'd noticed the date connection." "Yes, Mom died on the anniversary of Babsia's death. We thought about that when we were planning the memorial. But Mom had always said she wanted her service on the day she died, not delayed for convenience. It seemed appropriate somehow, like Babsia was calling her home." "Did your mother ever mention feeling connected to her mother's spirit, especially around that anniversary date?" Michael was silent for a long moment before answering. "Every year on Babsia's death anniversary, Mom would light candles and pray in Polish for hours. She said she could feel Babsia's presence on that day, like her mother was visiting to make sure she remembered the old prayers and traditions. Mom used to say that when her time came, Babsia would be there to guide her prayers and help her find her way." I realized I was documenting something far more significant than a technical audio anomaly. The recording had captured what appeared to be a spiritual reunion, a grandmother's voice guiding her daughter's memorial service, ensuring the proper prayers were spoken and the traditional rituals were observed. I decided to create two versions of the memorial recording. The standard version included only the clearly audible elements of the service: Father Martinez's homily, Michael's eulogy, and the family's spoken memories. But I also created a special version where I enhanced and highlighted the whispered Polish prayers, making them clearly audible alongside the English portions of the service. When I presented both versions to Michael, he chose to share the enhanced recording with his extended family. The response was unanimous and deeply moving. Elderly relatives who had known Helena Kowalski confirmed that the voice was authentic, and several mentioned hearing their own mother's or grandmother's voices whispering along during certain prayers. The recording became a treasured family heirloom, evidence that their matriarch had indeed attended her daughter's memorial service to guide the prayers and ensure the family traditions were properly observed. Rather than finding the phenomenon frightening, the family found it deeply comforting proof that love transcends death, and that the spiritual bonds between generations remain unbroken. But the experience changed how I approach my work as a sound technician. I pay closer attention now to the subtle layers of audio in memorial recordings, understanding that sometimes we capture more than just the spoken words of the living. I've learned to listen for the whispered prayers, the distant lullabies, and the quiet conversations that happen just beyond normal hearing. 3 months after the Kowalski service, I recorded a memorial for an elderly Italian man whose family swore they could hear his late wife humming their wedding song during the ceremony. When I analyzed that recording, I found exactly what they described: a soft humming that appeared during the priest's remarks about eternal love and marriage. I've started including a note with every memorial recording I deliver, letting families know that if they hear voices or sounds that seem significant to them, those elements are probably authentic parts of their loved one's farewell ceremony. Grief can sometimes open our hearing to frequencies we normally can't perceive, allowing us to experience the spiritual dimensions of death and remembrance. The technology I use to record these services captures sound waves with perfect accuracy, but I've learned that the most important elements of a memorial service aren't always visible or audible to everyone present. Sometimes the most meaningful moments happen in whispered prayers from impossible sources, in familiar voices that speak across the boundaries of death, to offer comfort and guidance to those left behind. My job is to preserve those moments, to create audio documents that honor both the living and the dead, and to trust that families will recognize the authentic spiritual communications meant specifically for them. In the end, the most beautiful memorial recordings aren't just documentation of funeral services. They're evidence that love continues to express itself even after the heart stops beating, and that the most important prayers are often the ones we can barely hear. Every morning at exactly 6 a.m., the temperature in retort chamber 3 would drop 15 degrees for precisely 3 minutes. I'm Dale, and I've operated the crematory at Peaceful Valley Memorial for 14 years. The job requires precision, respect, and strict adherence to both safety protocols and legal requirements. Every cremation follows the same careful procedures: temperature monitoring, timing documentation, and thorough record-keeping to ensure each family receives exactly what they expect from our services. The retort chambers are the heart of our operation, specially designed furnaces that reach temperatures of 1800 degrees Fahrenheit to ensure complete and dignified cremation. We have 4 chambers, numbered 1 through 4, each equipped with digital temperature monitoring and automated safety systems that alert me to any variations in operating conditions. Chamber 3 started behaving strangely after we cremated Harold Zimmerman on a Tuesday morning in late September. Mr. Zimmerman had been a clockmaker for 57 years, operating a small shop downtown where he repaired antique timepieces and crafted custom clocks. According to his family, Harold was legendary for his punctuality. He opened his shop at exactly 6 a.m. every morning for 4 decades, never varying his schedule by more than a minute or two. His dedication to precision had made him a beloved figure in the community, and customers would sometimes set their own watches by Harold's predictable routine. Harold died peacefully in his sleep at age 79, and his family chose cremation with a memorial service to celebrate his life and career. The cremation itself was routine, standard temperature, normal timing, complete process with no complications. I documented everything according to our usual procedures and thought nothing more about the case. But the next morning, something unusual happened with Chamber 3. At exactly 6 a.m., the digital temperature readout for Chamber 3 dropped from its normal ambient temperature of 72 degrees to 57 degrees. The drop was sudden and precise, lasting exactly 3 minutes before returning to normal. I initially assumed it was a sensor malfunction. These systems occasionally experience electronic glitches that resolve themselves. But the same thing happened the next morning, and the next. Always at exactly 6 a.m., always a 15-degree drop, always lasting precisely 3 minutes. I called our equipment maintenance company and scheduled a full diagnostic check of Chamber 3's monitoring systems. The technician spent half a day examining every component: temperature sensors, digital displays, heating elements, and computerized controls. Everything tested perfectly within normal parameters. Dale, this equipment is functioning exactly as designed, the technician told me. Whatever's causing the temperature readings you're seeing, it's not a mechanical or electronic malfunction. But the morning temperature anomaly continued, day after day, with clockwork precision that reminded me uncomfortably of Harold Zimmerman's legendary punctuality. I started documenting the phenomenon carefully, recording exact times, temperatures, and duration. The pattern never varied: 6 a.m. exactly, 15 degrees cooler, 3 minutes duration. I also began arriving earlier each morning to observe Chamber 3 directly during the temperature drop. What I discovered was even more puzzling than the digital readings. When I stood inside Chamber 3 during the 6 a.m. anomaly, I could actually feel the temperature change. The air became noticeably cooler, creating a distinct chill that raised goosebumps on my arms. But the cold wasn't uniform throughout the chamber. It seemed to concentrate in a specific area near the center of the space, roughly where a casket would be positioned during cremation. More disturbing was the sound that accompanied the temperature drop. Starting about 30 seconds before 6 a.m., I could hear what sounded like the faint ticking of a clock echoing inside the chamber. The ticking was slow and deliberate, like an old pendulum clock marking time with mechanical precision. The sound would continue throughout the 3-minute temperature anomaly, then fade away as the chamber returned to normal temperature. I researched Harold Zimmerman's background, thinking perhaps there was some detail about his death or his work that might explain the connection to Chamber 3. What I learned from his family and former customers painted a picture of a man whose entire life had been governed by precision timing and mechanical routine. Harold's shop had featured dozens of antique clocks, all synchronized to chime exactly at 6 a.m. when he arrived for work each morning. Customers described the sound as magical, a symphony of different chimes and bells that announced the beginning of Harold's workday. He had maintained this routine even after officially retiring, continuing to open the shop at 6 a.m. simply because, as he told his daughter, time doesn't retire, so neither can I. But here's what made the Chamber 3 anomaly particularly unsettling. Harold had died at exactly 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, discovered by his neighbor, who noticed that Harold's shop lights hadn't come on at their usual time. The temperature drop in Chamber 3 had begun the morning after Harold's cremation, and continued every day since, as if Harold were still reporting for work at his usual time, somehow managing to punch a time clock even from beyond death. I debated whether to share this information with Harold's family, ultimately deciding that some experiences are too strange to burden grieving relatives with. But the daily 6 a.m. ritual in Chamber 3 continued to affect me profoundly, creating a sense that I was witnessing something both beautiful and melancholy. 3 months after Harold's cremation, his daughter Margaret came to pick up some paperwork related to her father's services. During our conversation, she mentioned something that made me reconsider my decision to keep the Chamber 3 anomaly to myself. "You know, Mr. Dale, the strangest thing has been happening since Dad passed away. Every morning at exactly 6 a.m., I hear the sound of clock chimes coming from somewhere in my house. I've checked every timepiece I own, and none of them chime at that hour. But I swear I hear Dad's old shop clocks chiming at 6 a.m. just like they did every morning for all those years." Margaret paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "I know it sounds crazy, but it's almost comforting. Like Dad is still keeping time somewhere, still maintaining his schedule, even though his shop is closed forever." I decided to tell Margaret about the temperature anomaly in Chamber 3, describing the precise timing and the faint ticking sounds I'd been documenting. Rather than seeming disturbed by this information, she smiled with what appeared to be relief. "That sounds exactly like something Dad would do," she said. "He always said that time was the most important thing anyone could give to another person, and that being punctual was a way of showing respect. If he found a way to keep reporting for work, even after death, that would be just like him." Margaret asked if she could visit Chamber 3 during one of the 6 a.m. temperature events. The next morning, she arrived at 5:45 and accompanied me into the chamber to witness the phenomenon firsthand. At exactly 6 a.m., the temperature dropped, and the clock ticking began. Margaret stood quietly in the center of the chamber, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "Good morning, Dad. Thank you for still keeping time for all of us." The ticking seemed to intensify for a moment, as if acknowledging her presence, then gradually faded as the temperature returned to normal. After that morning, the Chamber 3 anomaly stopped occurring. I've thought a lot about Harold Zimmerman and his apparent need to maintain his punctual routine even after death. In a profession where time seems to stop for everyone who passes through our doors, Harold managed to keep his personal clock running, marking time with the same precision he'd shown throughout his life. The experience taught me that death might not end all routines, especially for people whose lives were defined by ritual and precision. Some spirits may continue performing the actions that gave their lives meaning, finding ways to maintain their responsibilities and honor their commitments even from impossible circumstances. Chamber 3 operates normally now, with no temperature anomalies or mysterious sounds. But every morning at 6 a.m., I pause for a moment and listen, remembering Harold Zimmerman and his dedication to keeping time for a world that moves too fast, to notice the beauty of perfect punctuality. Sometimes I wonder if Harold finally found peace when his daughter acknowledged his continued presence, or if perhaps he simply completed his final work assignment and was ready to clock out permanently. Either way, I hope that wherever Harold Zimmerman is now, time moves at exactly the pace he prefers, and every clock chimes precisely when it should. A payment receipt appeared in our files for services provided to Elena Vasquez, but our records showed no such client, and Elena had died 30 years before our funeral home opened. I'm Luz, and I've been the office manager at Serenity Memorial Services for 8 years. My responsibilities include maintaining client records, processing payments, and ensuring our administrative systems operate smoothly. The work requires meticulous attention to detail, because families depend on us to handle their loved ones' arrangements with precision and care. Our filing system is comprehensive and well organized. Every client interaction generates documentation that I maintain in both physical and digital formats. Payment receipts, service contracts, and family correspondence are all carefully preserved for legal and historical purposes. In 8 years of managing these records, I've never encountered a discrepancy that couldn't be explained through normal business operations. Until I found the Elena Vasquez receipt. I discovered it on a Monday morning in late October, while organizing payment records from the previous month. The receipt was filed alphabetically in the correct location, printed on our standard letterhead with our current formatting and logo. According to the document, Elena Vasquez had paid in full for a complete funeral service package, including embalming, viewing, memorial service, and burial arrangements. The receipt was dated 3 days earlier and signed with my own name in what appeared to be my handwriting. But I had never heard of Elena Vasquez, and I had no memory of processing her payment or creating this receipt. I immediately checked our client database for any record of Elena Vasquez. The search returned no results, no initial consultation, no service contract, no family contact information. I reviewed our appointment books for the previous month, looking for any mention of the Vasquez family. Nothing. I examined the receipt more carefully, thinking perhaps it was a clerical error involving a client with a similar name. The services listed were specific and detailed embalming by James Morrison, our head mortician, viewing in Chapel 2 on October 14th, memorial service conducted by Reverend Patricia Williams, burial at Hillside Cemetery in Plot 207. These were real services with real staff members at real locations, but according to our records, they had never been performed for anyone named Elena Vasquez. I checked with James about whether he had prepared anyone matching Elena's description during the time period indicated on the receipt. He reviewed his embalming logs and confirmed that he had worked on 3 cases that week, but none involved a client named Elena Vasquez. Reverend Williams checked her service schedule and confirmed that she had conducted memorial services on October 14th, but for the Morrison family, not anyone named Vasquez. I called Hillside Cemetery to inquire about Plot 207. The cemetery records showed the plot was occupied, but by Margaret Chen, who had been buried there in 1993, not Elena Vasquez, in recent weeks. Every detail on the receipt appeared to be authentic, except for the client's identity, which didn't exist in any of our systems. I decided to research Elena Vasquez independently, thinking perhaps she was connected to our funeral home in some way I hadn't discovered through our internal records. I started with online searches and public records databases. What I found made me question everything I thought I understood about our filing system. Elena Vasquez had indeed existed, but she had died on March 15, 1987, at the age of 43. According to her obituary, she had passed away after a brief illness and was survived by 2 daughters and a sister. The obituary mentioned that services were handled by Rodriguez Family Funeral Home, a business that had operated in our building from 1972 until 1995. Elena Vasquez had died 30 years before Serenity Memorial Services opened in our current location. I researched Rodriguez Family Funeral Home and discovered that they had indeed operated from our building for 23 years before closing, when the original owner retired. The building had remained empty for 2 years before we purchased it and established Serenity Memorial Services in 1997. But here's what made the situation even more puzzling. I found Elena Vasquez's original death certificate in the county records, and it listed her cause of death as the same condition that had affected Mrs. Morrison, whose memorial service Reverend Williams had conducted on October 14th, the same date listed on Elena's mysterious receipt. The next morning, I arrived early and searched through our older files, hoping to find some explanation for Elena's receipt. Hidden behind our current filing cabinets, I discovered a small storage area that contained boxes of records left behind by Rodriguez Family Funeral Home. The previous building owners had apparently left some old files when they vacated, and those boxes had been stored in our basement without anyone examining their contents. Among those forgotten records, I found Elena Vasquez's original service file from 1987. According to the Rodriguez Family Funeral Home records, Elena had requested a specific arrangement for her services: embalming, viewing, memorial service, and burial identical to what was listed on the receipt I had found in our current files. But there was a problem with her original arrangements. Elena's family had experienced financial difficulties during her illness, and they were unable to pay for the complete service package Elena had requested. The original receipt showed a partial payment, with a balance due that was never resolved. Elena had been buried with minimal services, far less than what she had hoped for during her final arrangements consultation. I realized that somehow Elena Vasquez had completed her original payment 30 years after her death, ensuring that the full service package she had requested in 1987 was finally documented as paid in full. But how could a woman who died in 1987 pay for services in 2017? And why would her receipt appear in our files with my signature and our current letterhead? I decided to research Elena's family, thinking perhaps one of her daughters had recently visited to settle old accounts or honor their mother's memory. I found contact information for Maria Vasquez Rodriguez, Elena's younger daughter, and called to ask about recent visits to funeral homes. Maria was confused by my inquiry. "I haven't had any contact with funeral homes recently. Why are you asking about my mother? She died 30 years ago." I explained about finding the receipt and asked if anyone in the family had been thinking about Elena recently or visiting her gravesite. "Actually, yes," Maria said slowly. "My sister Carmen and I were just talking about Mom last week. October 14th was the anniversary of her diagnosis, the day the doctors told her she was dying. We were remembering how frustrated she was that she couldn't afford the kind of funeral she wanted, how it bothered her that we had to settle for such simple arrangements." Maria paused, then continued. "Carmen and I have both done well financially over the years, and we've always felt guilty that we couldn't give Mom the dignified funeral she deserved. We've talked about maybe having a memorial service to honor her properly, but we never followed through." I told Maria about the mysterious receipt and the services listed on it, exactly the arrangements Elena had originally requested but couldn't afford. Rather than seeming frightened or confused, Maria began to cry. "That's exactly what Mom wanted. Every detail you just described matches what she talked about during those final weeks. She had very specific ideas about how she wanted to be remembered." I sent Maria a copy of the receipt, and she called back the next day with a request that surprised me. "Luz, I know this sounds strange, but would it be possible for my sister and me to actually pay for those services? Not the funeral itself, obviously, but maybe we could make a donation to your funeral home in Mom's memory, honoring the arrangements she wanted, but never received?" Maria and Carmen Vasquez visited the following week and made a substantial donation to our memorial fund, specifying that it should be used to help other families who struggle to afford dignified services for their loved ones. They also requested that we conduct a memorial service for Elena Vasquez, 30 years after her death, but finally including all the elements she had originally requested. We held Elena's memorial service in Chapel 2 on November 14th, exactly 1 month after the date on the mysterious receipt. Reverend Williams conducted the ceremony, and both of Elena's daughters spoke about their mother's life and their gratitude that her final wishes had somehow been honored. After the service, I filed the receipt in Elena's completed services folder, no longer a mysterious document, but a proper record of a family's love and a daughter's fulfilled wishes. I never discovered how Elena's receipt appeared in our files with perfect accuracy and my own signature, but I learned that sometimes the most important business we conduct involves honoring debts that transcend normal accounting procedures, and that love finds ways to complete transactions that were left unfinished by circumstance and time. The Elena Vasquez receipt remains one of the most beautiful documents in our files, evidence that death doesn't end all obligations, and that some payments are made by the heart long after the wallet is empty. Children's laughter echoed from viewing room C during adult services, but only when the deceased had been parents. I'm Kim, and I've worked as assistant director at Harmony Gardens Funeral Home for 12 years. Part of my responsibilities include managing our viewing rooms and ensuring that memorial services proceed smoothly and respectfully. Our facility has 4 viewing rooms, each designed to accommodate different sizes of gatherings and types of services. Viewing room C is our smallest space, typically used for intimate family services or when we need additional capacity during busy periods. The room features soft lighting, comfortable seating for about 30 people, and acoustic design that maintains privacy between concurrent services. In 12 years of working here, I had never noticed anything unusual about Room C until we began hosting services for parents who had lost children, or children who had lost parents. The phenomenon started during Mrs. Eleanor Patterson's memorial service in early September. Mrs. Patterson had been a retired elementary school teacher who passed away at age 71 after a long battle with diabetes. Her adult children had arranged a traditional viewing in Room C, expecting about 25 close family members and friends. Mrs. Patterson had been beloved in the community for her 43 years of teaching, and many former students planned to attend to pay their respects. The service began at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. Mrs. Patterson's children spoke lovingly about their mother's dedication to education and her special gift for connecting with young students. Several former pupils, now adults with children of their own, shared memories of Mrs. Patterson's kindness and patience in the classroom. About halfway through the service, during a particularly touching story about Mrs. Patterson's work with struggling readers, I heard something that made me pause in my duties. Soft laughter was coming from somewhere within Room C, the unmistakable sound of children giggling quietly, as if they were trying not to disturb a serious adult conversation, but couldn't quite contain their amusement. I initially thought some of the attendees had brought young children who were becoming restless during the solemn service, but when I discreetly scanned the room, I saw only adults. No children were present among the family members and former students gathered to honor Mrs. Patterson. The laughter continued sporadically throughout the service, never loud or disruptive, but clearly audible to anyone paying attention. It had the joyful quality of school children at recess, full of genuine happiness and innocent mirth. After the service, I asked Mrs. Patterson's daughter if she had heard the children's laughter during the memorial. "Oh yes," she replied with a smile. "Mom would have loved that. She always said the most beautiful sound in the world was children laughing, especially her students, when they finally understood a difficult lesson. She used to say that laughter meant learning was happening. I assumed the laughter had been an acoustic anomaly, perhaps sound carrying from another part of the building or even from outside. But 2 weeks later, during Mr. James Kowalski's memorial service, the same thing happened. Mr. Kowalski had been a father of 4 and grandfather of 9 when he passed away suddenly from a heart attack at age 62. His family filled Room C with stories about his playful nature and his devotion to his children and grandchildren. Several grandchildren had prepared drawings and letters to share during the service. During the family's presentations, I again heard children's laughter coming from within Room C, the same gentle, joyful sound that had accompanied Mrs. Patterson's service. But this time, Mr. Kowalski's actual grandchildren were present, so I thought perhaps they were the source of the laughter. However, when I observed more carefully, I noticed something disturbing. The laughter seemed to come from a different area of the room than where the Kowalski grandchildren were sitting. Moreover, the children who were actually present remained quietly attentive during their grandfather's service, showing no signs of the amusement I was hearing. The phantom laughter was coming from somewhere else entirely. Over the following months, I began paying closer attention to the audio environment in Room C during different types of services. I noticed that the children's laughter occurred only during memorial services for people who had been parents, teachers, or individuals who had worked closely with children during their lives. The laughter never occurred during services for people who had not had significant relationships with children. Young adults, elderly individuals without children, and people whose careers had not involved working with kids. Their services in Room C proceeded in normal silence. But whenever we hosted a memorial for someone who had been a parent, grandparent, teacher, coach, or pediatric healthcare worker, Room C filled with the soft sound of children at play. I started documenting the phenomenon, noting the specific times when the laughter occurred and the backgrounds of the deceased individuals whose services triggered the sound. The pattern was consistent and undeniable. The laughter seemed to respond to the emotional content of the services as well. During particularly touching stories about the deceased's relationship with children, the sound would intensify. When family members shared memories about bedtime stories, teaching moments, or playful interactions, the children's voices would become more animated, as if they were reacting to familiar and beloved memories. 3 months after I first noticed the phenomenon, we held a memorial service for Sarah Martinez, a 34-year-old pediatric nurse who had died in a car accident. Sarah had worked in the children's cancer ward at Regional Medical Center, and her service attracted dozens of colleagues, former patients' families, and friends whose children Sarah had cared for during difficult times. During Sarah's memorial, the children's laughter in Room C reached a level I had never experienced before. The sound was clear enough that several attendees looked around, trying to identify its source. But more remarkably, the laughter seemed to organize itself into patterns, bursts of giggles that sounded like responses to specific memories being shared by the speakers. When Sarah's supervisor spoke about her ability to make sick children smile, even during painful treatments, the laughter bubbled up like an audience of delighted kids. When a parent described how Sarah had sung lullabies to help their child sleep through chemotherapy sessions, the laughter softened into what sounded like contented sighs. After Sarah's service, I spoke with several attendees about whether they had noticed anything unusual during the memorial. Dr. Williams, the head of pediatric oncology, smiled when I asked about the children's sounds. I thought I was imagining it, but yes, I heard what sounded like my patients laughing. It was beautiful, actually. Sarah always said that laughter was the best medicine she could prescribe, and she had such a gift for bringing joy to children who had every reason to be sad. A mother whose daughter had been treated by Sarah said, "I kept thinking I heard my little girl giggling, the way she used to when Sarah would make funny faces during medical procedures. Emma's been gone for 2 years now, but I swear I heard her happy voice during the service." I realized that Room C wasn't just experiencing random acoustic phenomena. It was somehow collecting and preserving the joyful voices of children who had been touched by the lives we were celebrating. The laughter represented the enduring impact that caring adults have on young lives. Acoustic memorial to relationships that transcend death. I've never tried to eliminate or explain away the children's laughter in Room C. Instead, I've learned to appreciate it as one of the most beautiful aspects of my work. When families mention hearing their children's voices during memorial services, I don't dismiss their experiences as grief-induced hallucinations. I acknowledge that love creates its own echoes, and that the happiest memories sometimes find ways to express themselves even in the midst of sorrow. Room C has become our preferred space for services honoring parents, teachers, and caregivers. Families often comment on the warm, joyful atmosphere in that particular room, and many mention feeling comforted by a sense that their loved one is surrounded by the children they cared for during their lifetime. The laughter reminds me that the most meaningful work we do in this profession isn't just about honoring the dead. It's about celebrating the love that continues to resonate long after hearts stop beating. In Room C, that love expresses itself in the sound of children at play, grateful voices that refuse to be silenced by time or death. Sometimes, the most powerful eulogies aren't spoken by adult mourners, but laughed by the young spirits who remember being loved, protected, and cherished by people who understood that caring for children is the closest thing we have to immortality. Signatures appeared in the guest book during Mr. Morrison's viewing, written in handwriting that matched the deceased man's style, but belonging to his old war buddies who had died decades earlier. I'm Walsh, and I've been the funeral coordinator at Veterans Memorial Chapel for 16 years. My job involves managing the details of memorial services, from coordinating with families to ensuring that guest books, flower arrangements, and ceremonial elements are properly organized. Working with military families has taught me the special significance of brotherhood bonds forged in combat and the deep respect veterans show for their fallen comrades. The Morrison Memorial Service was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in late October. Staff Sergeant Robert Morrison had served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1970 and passed away at age 73 from complications related to Agent Orange exposure. His family had requested a military honors ceremony, and several members of Morrison's old unit planned to attend to pay their respects. I arrived early to set up the guest book and coordinate the arrival of Morrison's military colleagues. The guest book was positioned on a wooden podium near the entrance to the chapel, accompanied by a photograph of Morrison in his Army dress uniform and an American flag that had been presented to his family. The viewing began at 2 p.m., and Morrison's family and friends began arriving to sign the guest book and offer condolences. I monitored the guest registration as part of my normal duties, occasionally glancing at the signatures to ensure the book was filling properly and to note any special visitors who might need assistance. About an hour into the viewing, I noticed something unusual about several entries in the guest book. Mixed among the expected signatures from family members and contemporary friends were names written in handwriting that looked remarkably similar to Morrison's own style. The same angular lettering and confident strokes I recognized from Morrison's signature on his service contract. But the names being signed weren't Morrison's. They belonged to people with military-sounding names like Corporal Tommy Chen, Private First Class Miguel Santos, and Sergeant David Coleman. I initially assumed these were members of Morrison's unit who had traveled to attend the service, perhaps men whose handwriting had been influenced by shared military training or similar educational backgrounds. But when I looked around the chapel, I couldn't identify anyone who appeared to be the right age to have served with Morrison in Vietnam. The attendees I could see were either family members or civilians in their 60s and 70s people who would have been too young for Vietnam service or too old for Morrison's specific unit. During a quiet moment in the viewing, I approached Morrison's son, Michael, and asked about the military visitors who were signing the guest book. Military visitors? I haven't seen any of Dad's old Army buddies today. Most of the guys from his unit died years ago, and the few who are still alive live too far away to travel. Michael looked at the guest book entries I was indicating and frowned. Those names sound familiar, though. Let me think. He paused, then looked startled. Walsh. Those are the names of guys from Dad's squad in Vietnam. Tommy Chen, Miguel Santos, David Coleman. They were all in Dad's unit during his tour. Are they planning to attend the service today? Michael shook his head slowly. That's impossible. Tommy Chen died in a helicopter crash in 1970. Miguel Santos was killed by a landmine in 1969. David Coleman made it home, but died from cancer in the 1990s. Dad used to talk about them all the time, said they were the best soldiers he ever served with. I stared at the guest book entries, noting how the handwriting matched Morrison's own angular style so closely that it could have been written by the same person. But according to his son, the men whose names appeared in the book had been dead for decades. Michael, is there any chance other family members might have signed those names in memory of your father's fallen comrades? I don't think so. Most of our family never heard Dad talk much about the war. He only shared those stories with me, and only in the last few years when he started processing his experiences with the VA counselor. As the viewing continued, more military-style signatures appeared in the guest book names that Michael confirmed belonged to Morrison's deceased unit members, all written in handwriting that bore a striking resemblance to Morrison's own penmanship. By the end of the viewing, 12 names had appeared that belonged to soldiers who had died during or after the Vietnam War. Each signature was accompanied by military rank and service dates that Michael confirmed were accurate for his father's unit. But here's what made the situation even more unsettling. I had been monitoring the guest book area throughout the viewing, and I never saw anyone approach the podium during the times when the mysterious signatures appeared. The book was positioned in clear view of my station, and I would have noticed visitors writing entries. The signatures seemed to appear during moments when the guest book area was temporarily empty between family visits, or when attendees were gathered around Morrison's casket sharing memories. After the viewing, I photocopied the guest book pages and researched the names Michael had identified as Morrison's deceased unit members. Using military records and obituary databases, I confirmed that all 12 men had indeed served with Morrison in Vietnam and had died at various times between 1969 and 2003. What disturbed me most was the accuracy of the service information accompanying each signature. Ranks, unit designations, and service dates were all precise according to military records, including details that would have been difficult for anyone outside Morrison's immediate unit to know. The next morning, I called the VA counselor who had been working with Morrison during his final years, thinking perhaps Morrison had shared detailed information about his unit that might explain the guest book phenomenon. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had worked with Morrison for 3 years, helping him process combat trauma and survivor's guilt. When I described the mysterious signatures, she wasn't surprised by the names involved. Bob talked about those men constantly. Doctor, Martinez told me. He carried tremendous guilt about surviving when so many of his friends didn't make it home. He used to say he felt like he was living on borrowed time that should have belonged to them. She paused, then continued. In our final sessions, Bob expressed a deep wish that his old unit could somehow attend his funeral. He said he'd spent 50 years feeling like he'd left his brothers behind, and he wanted them to know he'd never forgotten their sacrifice. Did Morrison ever mention feeling their presence or having any kind of spiritual connection to his deceased unit members? Actually, yes. In his last few months, Bob started talking about dreams, where he would meet up with Tommy, Miguel, David, and the others. He said the dreams felt more real than waking life, and that his friends would tell him they were waiting for him, that they'd all be together again when his time came. Dr. Martinez added something that gave me chills. Bob was very specific about wanting his funeral to honor his entire unit, not just himself. He asked me to help him write letters to be read at his service, one for each man who didn't make it home. He wanted to make sure they were acknowledged and remembered. I asked if Morrison had written those letters in his own handwriting. Yes, he insisted on writing them by hand. Said it was more personal that way, more respectful. He spent weeks working on them, making sure he got everyone's rank and service details exactly right. I realized that the signatures in the guest book matched Morrison's handwriting. Because they were Morrison's handwriting somehow, he had managed to sign his deceased unit members into the guest book at his own funeral, ensuring that his brothers in arms were properly acknowledged and honored. That evening, I returned to the chapel and retrieved Morrison's handwritten letters from the family's service materials. When I compared the writing to the mysterious guest book signatures, the match was perfect. Not just similar handwriting, but identical pen pressure, letter formation, and stylistic details that would be impossible to duplicate without extensive practice or supernatural intervention. Morrison had somehow managed to attend his own funeral and sign in all the men who couldn't be there physically, fulfilling his final wish to honor his unit and acknowledge their service. I presented the guestbook analysis to Morrison's family during our follow-up meeting, explaining what I had discovered about the handwriting match and the accuracy of the military details. Rather than being disturbed by this information, Michael seemed deeply moved. "That's exactly what Dad would have done," he said. "He never stopped taking care of his men. If he found a way to make sure they were all honored at his funeral, that would be the most important mission he ever completed." The Morrison guestbook became one of our most treasured documents, evidence that some bonds transcend death, and that the deepest responsibilities of military service continue long after the war ends. We've used Morrison's story to help other veteran families understand that their loved ones' connections to fallen comrades represent a form of love that doesn't end with physical death. I've learned that funeral guestbooks sometimes capture more than just the signatures of living visitors. They become documents of spiritual reunions, records of relationships that survive every form of separation. In Morrison's case, the guestbook became a final roll call where every member of the unit was present and accounted for, 50 years after their last mission together. The signatures remind me that in the military, no one is ever truly left behind, and that the most important battles are often fought in the space between memory and love, where the living work to honor the dead, and the dead find ways to comfort the living. The GPS in Hearse 4 began rerouting to addresses where no pickup was scheduled, always arriving exactly when families needed transport but hadn't yet called for services. I'm Martinez, and I've been a transport driver for Riverside Memorial Services for 10 years. The job requires punctuality, respect, and careful attention to logistics. Families depend on us to arrive at the right place at the right time, often during their most vulnerable moments. Our fleet consists of 6 vehicles, each equipped with GPS navigation systems to ensure efficient routing and timely arrivals. Hearse 4 started behaving strangely in early November, about a week after we used it to transport Eleanor Walsh from the hospital to our preparation facility. Mrs. Walsh had been 87 when she passed away peacefully at Regional Medical Center, surrounded by family who had been maintaining a bedside vigil for several days. The transport was routine standard pickup procedures, respectful handling, and direct routing to our facility for preparation. Nothing about the case seemed unusual or particularly emotional beyond the normal gravity of our work. But the following week, Hearse 4's GPS system began displaying unexpected behavior. I noticed it first during a scheduled pickup at Memorial Hospital on Tuesday morning. I had programmed the GPS for the hospital's main entrance, but as I approached the facility, the system announced a route recalculation and directed me to turn left toward the residential area instead of continuing to the hospital. I initially assumed this was a software glitch. GPS systems occasionally experience temporary malfunctions that resolve themselves after restarting. I manually overrode the navigation and proceeded to my scheduled pickup at the hospital. But on the drive back to our facility, the GPS recalculated again, directing me to an address on Oak Street that wasn't on my schedule. The system's voice instructions were clear and insistent, repeatedly announcing turn-by-turn directions to 427 Oak Street. I decided to follow the GPS detour, thinking perhaps dispatch had sent an updated pickup request that I hadn't received yet. When I arrived at 427 Oak Street, I found a modest single-story home with an elderly man sitting on the front porch, holding a small suitcase. The man approached Hearst 4 as I parked in front of his house. "Are you here for Eleanor?" he asked quietly. I checked my schedule and call log, confirming that I had no pickup scheduled at this address. "I'm sorry, sir, but I think there's been a mistake. I don't have any record of a pickup request for this location." The man looked confused and disappointed. "My wife Eleanor passed away about an hour ago. The hospice nurse said I should expect the funeral home to arrive soon, to take her to be prepared for services." I realized that Hearst 4's GPS had somehow directed me to a death that had occurred so recently that dispatch hadn't yet received notification from the hospice service. The man's wife had died while I was completing my scheduled hospital pickup, and the GPS had automatically rerouted me to provide transport services before the family had even made contact with our funeral home. I called dispatch to verify the situation and learned that Regional Hospice had indeed been trying to reach us about Eleanor Hartwell at 427 Oak Street, but their call had come in during the few minutes when our phones were temporarily down due to a system update. This was an extraordinary coincidence. The GPS malfunction had directed me to exactly where I needed to be, exactly when a family needed our services, before our normal communication systems had processed the request. But the coincidence repeated itself. Over the following 2 weeks, Hearst 4's GPS rerouted me to unscheduled addresses 4 more times. Each detour led to a home where someone had recently died, and the family was preparing to call funeral services. In every case, my arrival preceded the official pickup request by 10 to 30 minutes. The GPS seemed to have developed an uncanny ability to anticipate death notifications and guide me to families who needed immediate assistance. Mrs. Chen, on Maple Street, who had passed away in her sleep and was discovered by her daughter that morning. Mr. Rodriguez on Pine Avenue, who had died during his afternoon nap while his son was calling to schedule a routine visit. Miss Patterson on Elm Street, an elderly woman who had died while reading in her garden, found by neighbors who were just beginning to discuss whether to call authorities. In each case, the GPS provided perfect directions to addresses that weren't in our database, arriving precisely when families needed support, but before they had managed to contact funeral services through normal channels. I started documenting these incidents, noting the timing, addresses, and circumstances of each unexpected detour. The pattern was consistent and impossible to explain through normal technological glitches or coincidence. More disturbing was the specific nature of the GPS announcements during these rerouting episodes. The system would announce destination changes using unusually compassionate language, saying things like, "recalculating route to provide assistance," instead of the standard "recalculating route" message. During one particularly memorable incident, the GPS directed me to assist the Morrison family on Sunset Drive, announcing, "rerouting to help James Morrison say goodbye to his father." When I arrived, I found James Morrison sitting in his car outside his childhood home, having just discovered that his father had passed away during his weekly visit. James had been paralyzed by grief and uncertainty about what to do next, and my arrival provided immediate practical support during his most vulnerable moment. He later told our office that having professional assistance arrive so quickly had been a blessing that helped him navigate the overwhelming logistics of death. I began to suspect that Hearst 4's GPS anomalies were connected to Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, the woman we had transported shortly before the rerouting incidents began. I researched her background and discovered something remarkable about her life and career. Eleanor Walsh had worked as a telephone operator for 43 years, from 1952 until 1995, when automated systems replaced human operators. Her specialty had been emergency call routing, connecting people to police, fire, and medical services during crisis situations. Eleanor's supervisor at the telephone company described her as having an almost supernatural ability to anticipate emergency calls and route assistance before people had finished explaining their situations. She had received multiple commendations for directing help to people who needed it most, often using intuition and experience to interpret partial information and incomplete addresses. Eleanor had spent her entire career connecting people who needed help with people who could provide it, using technology to bridge the gap between crisis and assistance. I realized that Hearst 4's GPS wasn't malfunctioning. It was being guided by someone who had spent a lifetime helping others during their most desperate moments. Eleanor Walsh had found a way to continue her work even after death, using the navigation system to ensure that grieving families received prompt, compassionate assistance during their darkest hours. The GPS incidents continued for 3 months, then gradually decreased in frequency before stopping entirely. During that time, Hearst 4 helped me assist 17 families who hadn't yet contacted funeral services, but desperately needed immediate support and guidance. Each unexpected arrival provided comfort and practical assistance to people who were overwhelmed by sudden loss and uncertain about next steps. The GPS ensured that no one had to face death alone or navigate funeral arrangements without professional support. Hearst 4's navigation system now operates normally, displaying standard GPS functionality without mysterious rerouting or compassionate destination announcements. But the experience taught me that our work extends beyond scheduled pickups and official service requests. Sometimes, the most important assistance we provide happens when families haven't yet realized they need help, and sometimes, the best navigation comes from people who understand that the shortest distance between crisis and comfort is a caring person who shows up exactly when they're needed most. Eleanor Walsh spent her career connecting people to the help they needed, and somehow she managed to continue that work from beyond death, ensuring that grieving families were never alone in their moment of greatest need. The GPS incidents reminded me that service doesn't end with death for people whose lives were dedicated to helping others, and that the most important directions we receive sometimes come from impossible sources. Appointment times appeared blocked out in our system for clients who had never booked services, each corresponding to the exact moment someone died alone in the city. I'm Alex, and I've been the operations manager at Gateway Memorial Services for 7 years. My responsibilities include overseeing our appointment scheduling system, coordinating staff assignments, and ensuring that our facility operates efficiently to serve grieving families. Our computerized scheduling system is essential for managing multiple services, staff rotations, and facility usage across our 3 chapels and preparation areas. The mysterious appointment blocks began appearing in late December, always scheduled for times when our facility should have been available for legitimate bookings. I first noticed them during our end-of-year scheduling review, when I was analyzing appointment patterns to plan for the traditionally busy January period. Scattered throughout our December calendar were appointment blocks lasting exactly 2 hours each, scheduled under names I didn't recognize and accompanied by service codes that didn't match our standard offerings. The blocked appointments had titles like J. Patterson, Final Consultation, and M. Rodriguez Departure Arrangements. But when I searched our client database, none of these individuals appeared in our records. There were no intake forms, no family contact information, and no payment records associated with these mysterious appointments. Initially, I assumed these were data entry errors created by staff members who had accidentally input placeholder appointments or practice entries into our live system. I deleted the first few anomalous blocks and made a note to remind staff about proper system usage. But the mysterious appointments continued to appear, always scheduled with perfect timing and precise 2-hour durations that suggested intentional booking rather than random data corruption. Over the following weeks, I began documenting the pattern more carefully, noting the names, times, and service descriptions associated with each unexplained appointment block. What I discovered was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The appointment times consistently aligned with death notifications we received from hospitals, nursing homes, and private residences throughout the city. When someone died at Regional Medical Center at 3:47 p.m., our system would show an appointment block from 3:47 to 5:47 p.m. for a name that matched the deceased individual. But here's what made the phenomenon impossible to explain through normal means. The appointment blocks appeared in our system before we received official notification of the deaths. On January 15th, our system showed a 2-hour appointment block for Thomas Chen, Transition Services, scheduled from 11:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. At 12:45 p.m., we received a call from Sunset Manor Nursing Home reporting that Thomas Chen had passed away at 11:30 a.m. and requesting pickup services. Thomas Chen had made his own appointment at the exact moment of his death, booking a time slot that corresponded perfectly with our availability and his need for services. This pattern repeated itself daily throughout January and February. Every mysterious appointment block corresponded to someone who died alone, people who passed away without family present, individuals who died in their sleep, elderly residents of care facilities who died during quiet moments between staff visits. The appointment descriptions were consistently poetic and dignified. Final journey arrangements, departure planning session, transition consultation, and homecoming preparation. These weren't standard funeral service categories, but they conveyed a sense of purpose and intentionality that suggested the appointments were meaningful to whoever was creating them. I decided to research the individuals whose names appeared in the mysterious appointment blocks, thinking perhaps there was some connection that would explain how they were accessing our scheduling system. What I found was that every person who had self-scheduled an appointment through our system had died completely alone, without family or friends present during their final moments. Many were elderly individuals who had outlived their relatives, homeless individuals who died in shelters or on the streets, or isolated people who died in apartments and weren't discovered for days. These were people who had lived their final months or years without meaningful human connection, yet somehow they had managed to schedule their own funeral arrangements with perfect timing and appropriate dignity. I began tracking the mysterious appointments more systematically, checking them against hospital death records and coroner reports to verify the timing correlation. The accuracy was remarkable. Appointment start times matched death times within 1 or 2 minutes, and the 2-hour duration consistently aligned with our standard preparation and transport procedures. But the most remarkable aspect of these self-scheduled appointments was their effect on our staff and services. When we followed up on the deaths that corresponded to the mysterious appointment blocks, we invariably found individuals who needed our assistance desperately. Many had no family to arrange services, no financial resources for burial, and no advocates to ensure they received dignified treatment. The self-scheduled appointments seemed to flag cases where our intervention could make the difference between anonymous county disposal and respectful memorial services. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, whose appointment block appeared on February 3rd, had died alone in her apartment and wasn't discovered until her neighbor noticed uncollected mail. The self-scheduled appointment led us to contact her landlord, who revealed that Dorothy had been saving money for her own funeral arrangements but didn't know how to make advance plans. James Rodriguez, who self-scheduled on February 10th, had died at a homeless shelter, but had been carrying our business card in his wallet, along with a handwritten note expressing his hope for a dignified funeral despite his financial circumstances. The mysterious appointments were somehow connecting us with people who needed our services most, but lacked the resources or social connections to arrange them through normal channels. I realized that our scheduling system was being used by people who understood they were dying alone, but wanted to ensure they wouldn't be forgotten after death. Somehow, at the moment of dying, they were managing to create appointment blocks that would bring their cases to our attention and ensure they received respectful treatment. I stopped deleting the mysterious appointment blocks and instead began treating them as referrals for pro bono services. When a self-scheduled appointment appeared in our system, I would investigate the corresponding death and determine how our funeral home could provide dignified services regardless of the family's financial situation. Over 6 months, the self-scheduled appointments led us to provide memorial services for 23 individuals who would otherwise have received anonymous county burials. We were able to locate distant relatives for some, arrange simple but dignified services for others, and ensure that everyone received the respect and care they deserved during their final arrangements. The mysterious appointments stopped appearing in our system in late June, as suddenly as they had begun. But the experience fundamentally changed how we approach our work and our relationship with the community. We established a formal program for providing services to individuals who die alone, partnering with social services, hospitals, and housing organizations to identify cases where our intervention could make a meaningful difference. The program is named Final Consultation Services, in honor of the appointment descriptions that first alerted us to these overlooked deaths. I've learned that death sometimes finds ways to advocate for itself, especially when the dying person has been forgotten or overlooked by society. The self-scheduled appointments reminded me that everyone deserves dignified treatment after death, regardless of their social connections or financial resources. The scheduling system now operates normally, but I pay closer attention to the names and circumstances of every death notification we receive. And sometimes, when I'm working late and the office is quiet, I think I can hear the faint sound of keyboard typing coming from the empty reception area, someone still making appointments, still ensuring that the forgotten are remembered and the alone are cared for. The most important appointments we keep are often the ones we never officially scheduled, arranged by people who understood that death is a transition that requires assistance and that everyone deserves someone to show up when they call for help, even if that call comes from impossible places.